I wanted to talk about big picture mistakes on land, and it's something that we see all the time. Dylan and I have gone through this, gone through similar videos recently, and I thought it'd be a new perspective. You know, we have a podcast. We've had 16 episodes out that we've recorded. The 16th one was the other night with Brandon from First Choice Food Plots. He comes to our house often for what he calls beer and coffee, meaning if he says he's coming for beer and coffee, that's an overnight. So he's working on clients in the area, and he's planting. He was spraying over the weekend for pre-emergent for corn. But bottom line is, Brandon's a wealth of knowledge because he's gone to many clients over several states. He works on a very large scale for planting, dozing, mulching trees, forestry mulching trees out, planting native grasses, switchgrass, food plots. And a lot of times, as we'll talk about, some of his experiences run into designing properties too. But what this was our exact podcast notes right here, which are really rough. I'll put it that way. So I might not cover all the points we had, but I wanted to talk about these big picture mistakes that people make on land, and I wanted to bring in that perspective of Brandon and Jen, because Jen sees a lot of this too. She hears me talk about it, and Jen was on her first clients on Monday and Tuesday with me in Michigan. So kind of a unique perspective on her part. But Brandon, just say really quick, he works in Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. So that's where he plants, that's where he sprays, that's where he does all his work. He dozes food plots, he does everything. And so he has a pretty big customer base all over. He has a lot of them that he works with over and over and over again. And then he just keeps building from there with employees, multiple tractors, and custom corn planting equipment. He has equipment that's more on a small scale as far as related to ag fields, where he's planting 4 rows at a time. So he's spraying nitrogen, spraying herbicide, and planting all at the same time with one unit so they can get it done. And he's been here where he's planting corn and switchgrass in the same day. So really unique perspective. He's been doing this for many years. And one of the things that he mentioned on what he sees overall, and we'll talk about a couple other perspectives of that too, is landowners out there that just have bad improvements in, well, could be good improvements, but in bad locations. And so one of the things he saw recently was just a huge hinge cut bedding area that was right next to a stand location. So in theory, they're making bedding in this location, but then every time you walk in and out, you're spooking deer. And oh, by the way, that was right next to a food plot. So you're spooking deer off the food plot or the bedding area. You're doing it off one or the other, depending on what time you're going in. If you go in the morning hours, you're probably spooking it off the food plot, or deer off the food plot. If you go in the afternoon, you're spooking deer off the bedding area right next to the stand. And that's what we see over and over again. So Brandon, he's going out to plant for a client, or spray, or mow, whatever it might be, or forestry mulch. And then he gets kind of sucked into sometimes because he runs that balance of he's there to do a job for what he estimates to be 4 or 5 hours of taking care of these 4 acres of plots, doing whatever he's doing within his loop of travel and work. And then he gets there and things are located very poorly, and he ends up spending a lot of time on design for that client. He gets behind because of that. So, you know, it's not just ready will show up and there's stakes in the ground. He gets there and looks at it like, wow, this is bad. This is going to hurt you for hunting, because as someone who's a really serious buck hunter like Brandon, he can't help but look at some of these mistakes that people see and actually say something. So he got really sucked into that. But a lot of it had to do with where the stand's located versus where the improvement is, and really setting yourself up for failure, because the more attractive that improvement, the more you're going to fail going in and out and spooking deer, because that attraction attracts a lot of deer, attracts them to your access, I call it. It attracts them to your feet when you're walking in, and you end up spooking more deer than the habitat improvement was worth in the first place. Because if you're building habitat improvements and you're spooking deer because of those habitat improvements, you're better off not having the habitat improvement at all. The deer, you're not helping the deer that much to risk ruining your whole land and your hunt. And frankly, the deer herd that turned into a nocturnal deer herd and someone else takes care of them during the day. It's all about taking care of them during the day and not spooking them off your land when you hunt. A lot of that results in cleanup. And what I mean by cleanup is, of course, it could be bedding areas in the wrong spot, switchgrass. He'll go into a lot of switchgrass areas and they're full of weeds. And so you run into the weed problems of you have to take care of the switch. So a lot of times there's so many weeds in the switchgrass field because it wasn't taken care of that he's had to start completely over again. And you can't just burn the weeds out. You can't just mow the weeds out It can take a decade or more. Maybe you can burn, burn in the spring. But bottom line is, and let the switchgrass come back. But if that weed bank is in the ground and you allow it to take a foothold of 30, 40% in your switchgrass, it's really hard to reverse that. So he sees that. He sees a lot of problems with size of the plots. And that's what we see. We have a video coming out. We'll talk about why and how to really estimate the size of your plots. You'd think it'd be a really elementary thing when it comes to food plotting. But almost every plot we go to, and I think Dylan could attest to this too, so many plots you look at, yeah, this is about 1.5 acres, it's really a 1/2 acre, or 3/4 of an acre, or an acre, or they say it's an acre, everyone wants to round up to an acre, but it's a 1/2 acre. So that greatly affects the volume of growth that you're going to have. For example, like with brassica where it gets stunted, or corn where it gets stunted, let alone wasting seed when it comes to beans, clover, chicory, other crops, where you just don't need to put that much seed out. It's self-pruning, so it's not going to be too thick and stifle each other out. It's just going to be a waste of seed. So that happens a lot too. Self-pruning meaning like clover. You can triple your clover rate. It's just going to come in and it's going to grow. It'll fill that space, but you're not going to have stunted clover like you would with a brassica field or a cornfield. So size of the plots is critical to your success, and that's where a lot of cleanup comes in too. And you can imagine with Brandon, where he's charging for 4 acres, he gets there and it's only 1.75. You know, he's okay with that. I'm sure he'd love to charge for it, but consciously, you know, that's a time factor. He gets there and wow, it's only going to take him half the time because it wasn't estimated correctly. And so that's a little chink in his schedule and planting schedule. For me, it was access. You know, that was where the big picture mistake, because, you know, the things we spend the most time on with clients are where food plots go. Food plots are the highest attraction per square inch on your land, and you have to have them on a private parcel. So if you're spooking out your food plots because of your access, it's bad. So food plots determine where your access goes. Access on your land determines where the food plots go. They work hand in hand. So very critical, let alone a poorly located bedding area, poorly located water hole that you have to walk by all the time and you spook the deer that are hitting it. So access is so critical, and everyone knows that. But with the properties we see, dozens of property, I see dozens of property a year. I'll see 84 this year. It's one of my lower levels because I'm trying to cut back. But Dylan, how many different lands will you see this year?
I've got, I think, 75 days scheduled. I would guess that probably puts me on 65 different properties.
Yeah, some of the fly-ins that take a couple days or larger parcels. But yeah, so you end up seeing this all the time where everyone talks about access is so critical, but they don't hide their access. Deer can hear them coming in. Deer can smell them coming in, let alone see them. And that's all set up in a bad way by the habitat improvements that are on the property. The more you define improvements that fit together and pull deer to one side, the more you can access on the other. People say, well, it's random. I can't get in the morning. I can't get in the afternoon, but especially morning time. Well, the more you define where food is, meaning it's towards one side of your property or in an area where it allows enough room to get around it in the morning, then the more you can actually access and have a morning hunt. Rarely, I don't remember a property where you just go to a property and say, oh, there's no morning hunting here. It might have been no morning hunting the way it was designed, but there's always changes that can be made to food locations to pull them to one side, and that's why we don't like random food. We don't like food all over the property, let alone it infringes on depth of cover and how it affects your ability to actually hold a mature buck because there's no space left over. There's does all over the property. And that could have been one of my other big picture mistakes, is just doe populations in general. We go to a lot of properties where there's excess doe numbers, and the does on the property, because of what they're doing, will always hinder their ability to even come close to the potential of the land. We've seen property that has been sold to go to another property because they had a doe problem. But then they went to the new property, planted a whole bunch of summer food plots, hunted it poorly, and you still have more does. And so you have a lot of does. They're daylight on the property, and the bucks become nocturnal because there's too many does in the property. Hunting pressure affects that too. So it's not about changing property, it's about changing the habitat when you plant it, when you plant your food plots, and that's a big picture mistake too. But a lot of that boils back down to access. You know, if you have poorly located food plots, you have a hard time getting on and off the property. Jen, with her experience, especially even just going into, well, here a lot, and her own hunting, that she's hunted. She's shot deer in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and then around here in Minnesota and Wisconsin. So she's hunted a lot of different locations, but she was blown away, and I told her this is normal. We're not picking on these clients, but the clients that she went to, it was fairly normal of what we get to see, where there's a lot of blinds on the food plots. And blinds on the food plots, it's very deceiving because we're driving around, does are just standing watching us drive by. And you go into a food plot with a big blind on it. Literally, some of the food plots were planting to the blind legs. So she said, boy, on that property, what really jumped out to me is the stand location. So we talked about with the client moving almost every one of their blind locations so they were actually hidden when they walked in and out, even lowering some or putting some on a ridge behind some brush so they could get in and out without spooking deer, because that is key. If you can't get in and out of your stand without spooking deer, or if you have a high expectation of spooking deer when you get in and out, then you're already behind before the season even starts. And so that's really stuck out to her. But you know, that's a problem too. We were watching, I like watching hunting videos, and especially some of the old throwback Drury Brother videos. So Jen and I watched 2 or 3 the other day and showed Mark Drury killing this giant buck out of a blind right on the food plot with a little brush behind him so he could walk in and out. But they're right out in the open. We saw a couple bucks being taken like that in those blinds. Well, that's Iowa. It's very deceiving. And these are areas that aren't hunted very often at all. They might shoot a big buck out of that location every year, but it's only sat 2 or 3 times, 4 times. So different state, different level of hunting pressure, and people will watch that and then take that back to their own land in New York, Pennsylvania, portions of Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, even portions of Illinois, Indiana. And then you go over all the way to the East Coast and Southeast and areas where you have average to high hunter densities, and folks, that just doesn't work. So we go to a lot of properties, therefore, that blinds are right on the plot, sometimes right in the middle of the plot, and they really have to be moved. And so that's critical. So Jen was really onto that one, the property that she went to and saw, and that was a big problem there of adjusting every stand location, let alone getting rid of some food plots where you have to walk through bedding to get there. You can't blow your scent anywhere if you are sitting on that plot to hunt. So it's really not any use having a food plot in a location you actually can't hunt. You at least hunt with a gun. But a lot of times you're putting it back in the center of cover and you're fragmenting your depth of cover. And depth of cover is just referring to you have food, you have does, and then you have bucks bedding. Sometimes because you have food, does bedding, and then another food source, you literally don't have room and space left over for bucks because they do not like to bed right next to all those does and fawns. So if you don't have enough depth versus cover, that ratio, typically you want to see a 20 acres with 5 acres of food plots in the front will still give you over 300 yards of cover in the back. A 40-acre parcel with a 5-acre food plot in the middle of it only gives you 155 yards of depth all around. That's bad. That 20 acres is worth more to hunting than that 40. We asked Brandon, do you ever see food plots in wrong locations? And this is a big one. So he'll get there to plant 4 acres. They've shown maps of it. They've talked about what they want to plant, the existing field. He knows he needs to spray. He needs to take care of this. He knows what the amount of weeds are on the plot and what he has to take care of weeds. But he gets there in the food plot. He just looks at it. It's right behind their cabin, or it's where they have to walk through to get to the rest of the land. Then he's in that position where he can't spend 5 hours redesigning their property for him. But what he'll do is he kind of walks that fine line of showing up and having to spend 2 days to redesign their entire property and getting the job done that he was hired for and he's there for. He's already spent the time to get there. And so what he'll do is he'll work that, he'll talk about it, he might make a couple soft mentions, and then when he goes back the next year, he'll put it back on them. How do you see this food plot working? Is it a daylight parcel or deer hitting it during the daylight? Do you ever see deer spooking deer? Spooking off the land when you come in and out? And at that point, it can be more of a discussion of where can we move this food plot to, and it's more of a progression right there. But it's not his job like it is ours. Dylan and I, Kevin, Joe, Wes, later on in the year, we need to go to a parcel and say, this is a bad spot for a food plot. This is a bad spot for a blind. This is a bad spot for a tree stand, for access, for bedding areas, let alone food plots. And we need to explain why and how it would serve them to have that location somewhere else on the land based on their access and where they need to actually hold deer and move deer. So that's one of the things we see a lot. Almost on every parcel, you see food plots located in the wrong spot. The cool thing about that is a lot of times food plots can quickly be converted to switchgrass or some type of cover. So a food plot that's in a bad location is typically because you shouldn't be walking by there in the first place. It's more cover, bedding related. So quickly turn that into bedding, and now you just flipped it in one growing season. Because it doesn't matter if the switchgrass, for example, in there is only 2 feet high, or the shrubs you planted are just sprouting out. The bottom line is there's no food there, so bucks feel more inclined to bed 10 yards off that edge, even if the cover within it isn't that great, because you don't have the high traffic going into it every single day. But food plot locations were big. They're big for Joe, Kevin, Dylan, and I, let alone what Jen saw and what Brandon sees on a daily basis when he's doing this for a living. Single species management. We see this a lot where clients, not I say a lot, but we see a percentage of the time where clients are so focused on bucks. And it might not even be a bad thing. It might be they love to see some grouse, some pheasants, some rabbits, some of those other indicator species of good, and some turkey nesting habitat, some of those indications of good property. They like to see that, but they're so focused on bucks that it's almost competitive. I've seen clients that they're not happy with the 160, 170, so they quickly sell their property and go buy an hour and a half away. All of a sudden we're getting a call, and they talked about doing everything on the other parcel. They didn't even hunt a season, and they're buying another 80 acres somewhere because they want that bigger inch antler, and they don't realize a lot of times how many other wildlife species they're incorporating and that they can enjoy on those parcels. And so we look at our own property, and I think it's different when you have your own property, and you really look at it and say, wow, this is cool. We have so many rabbits. We have pheasant we're starting to see. We have grouse. We have turkey nesting. We're seeing more poult. We're seeing an expansion in the turkey population, and we know that that's coming from the habitat. So it's pretty cool to see when you're seeing that every day. But I'd like people to think about that we enjoy seeing all this wildlife. I know you do too, but kind of think about when you're doing a great job with whitetail, you're going to incorporate a lot of other wildlife species, and the two really go hand in hand. Now, we have those 4 indicator species of turkey nesting, grouse, pheasant, rabbits, and there's some locations that'll never have a pheasant. There's some areas that'll never have a grouse. That's okay. The bottom line is you're doing your best to incorporate as many wildlife species as possible. And what you find is when you're managing for all those species, or as many species as you can, you end up with an incredible whitetail parcel, especially when you put it all together, thinking about access, stand locations, improvement, so they're doing more good for you than harm as it relates to your access coming in. Understanding switchgrass. Jen's been familiar with switchgrass for several years. Brandon plants it for a living. What we see all the time is Brandon ran into an imbalance the other day where person has 30, 40 acres of field to work with, and they're only planting 3 acres of food plots and the rest in switch. And that's a bad balance. They have a lot of room that they can actually plant for wildlife diversity pockets, deer bedding, more food plots. And by putting it all in switch, it's less maintenance. You have to take care of it the first couple of years, and then you can just let it go. But folks, big switchgrass fields are a big waste of space. We have switchgrass out here over 3 miles, totaling 13, 14, 15 acres after the end of this year. We have 13, 14 already. But a lot of that isn't more than 100 feet wide down to 10 feet wide, because it's more as edging and a complement to regeneration, hardwood regeneration that's growing up along the woods edge that makes that attraction for all wildlife species, but gives us the cover for getting in and out for screening. Even a 10-acre field, you don't want any more than 5 acres of that being switchgrass. And it's not 5 acres in a solid block. It's 5 acres of switchgrass surrounding the 10 acres, maybe surrounding some food sources in, and then surrounding diversity pockets or early successional growth pockets that you allow to grow up in that area that are protected by the screening from the switch. So the switch becomes a base form of cover, not a grass or habitat the deer are going to bed in. If deer are going to bed into that CRP and there's a little switch in there, that's because there's a lot of browse and they're bedding in it, but then it all falls down in the fall and there's no cover. So rarely do I like seeing switch planted with anything else, because you're using it to screen off bedding areas into line field edge, and you're using it for solid access. And if you diminish it by putting, quote, diversity into it of other grass species or broadleafs, then you're ruining what is attractive about switch, which is pure cover. And so that's why you take a 20-acre field maybe 10 acres of it is in switch, but switchgrass is protecting those pockets and that outside of the 20-acre field, so you can actually hold wildlife in the inside. Whereas if that's just 20 acres of switch, you just wasted a ton of space. You'll find deer bedding around the edges in the woods, but you're not going to find a rabbit in the middle, let alone a pheasant, let alone deer, unless there's literally no cover in the area and that's their only choice. There's a big misunderstanding a lot of times of switchgrass, where you're planting, you think you're going to plant switchgrass, you're going to have this great habitat improvement on your property as a whole on 10 acres, when really you should have cut that up. It should be a part of it. It should be solid where it's planted. But then the diversity and the food and regeneration and the browse are in other areas that total at least 50% of that area. I hope that makes sense. A big misunderstanding about switchgrass sometimes, and I think that's how it's marketed. You know, this is going to be your deer bedding area. You buy it as such and you plant it thinking it's going to hold every deer in the county, and that's just not the way it works. We get down here to 8. This is our portion of our podcast, where obviously this isn't a podcast, but we talk about jokes. So Jen always had jokes. So she goes over a couple of her favorite jokes at the end, which are awesome. I'll just put it that way. So, and then in the beginning we do a Jen's mailbag, and so she talked about, she'll talk about a favorite email that came in over the past week, and so we started doing that. We did that this week with a person that started off, I'll let you guys listen to the podcast, but they started off with, my wife thinks that Jeff's voice is boring, and asked me, why do you listen to that boring guy every night, you know, on the videos and listening? So Jen discussed that. He did say some nice things afterwards. I'm slowly converting her, whatever her name is. But bottom line is, we get some goofy emails. We get some great questions. We try to go over those in our podcast too. But bottom line is, check out the podcast. The link is in the description. Of course, check out the seed company, WHS Wildlife Blends, and WHS Seed Blends. We have 12 different seed blends we offer. Wes is up there full-time answering your questions. Jen is too. And really appreciate you checking out. Make sure you check out the podcast. And I hope you like this big picture management. I just more of like, most of our podcasts are more in that 45, 50-minute range. We dialed this down a little bit for you. This is more the cliff notes. So I think you'll enjoy more of the entertainment and getting to know us on a different level, listening to the podcast, and kind of an expansion of what we talked about here today. Now, I don't know if you've checked out our main website lately, whitetailhabitatsolutions.com, but we've really had a lot going on, including hats, books, our web class, and certainly our new seed company, WHS Wildlife Blends. When you click on seed on our site, it'll take you right to our brand new site for the seed company. We have all 12 blends available. So check it all out though. I encourage you, I appreciate you checking it out. Whether you buy anything or not, really appreciate you visiting the site and seeing what's going on, and continue to watch because we have big things coming later this year.